Hello, everyone. Welcome to another video of Israelite podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Bruce Chilton, and today we're going to be discussing whether the Gospel of John is independent of the three synoptic Gospels or not. I've had different people on my channel, different views on that regard. This is debated in academia. I believe currently that the majority still think that it is independent of the synoptics, but there are some that have recently been tempted by the idea, such as Dr. Dale Martin. He thinks that the Gospel of John might have known Mark. Unsure if it used Matthew and Luke, but there are other scholars like Dr. James Barker who thinks that John knew Matthew, and yeah, so there's different positions about how John is looked at in comparison and in terms of contrasting from the synoptics and scholarship. So welcome back to the channel, Dr. Chilton.
Thank you very much. It's enjoyable always to talk to you.
Likewise. So do you think the Gospel of John is totally independent, mostly independent, or does it heavily rely on the synoptics? What is your view on this?
In my view, I think that it is clear that there is an awareness in John, first of all, of a variety of oral traditions prior to John itself. And I would tend to agree with those who have concluded that John is also aware of the existence of what we would call the synoptic gospels. I think the degree of similarity with them uh, does vary quite considerably. So, for example, John's gospel is intriguingly similar to Luke's, where it concerns the amount of contact that Jesus' own followers had with those who were judging Jesus at the end of his life. Uh, on the other hand, an argument has recently been made that when in the Gospel according to John, in the story of Cana, uh, Jesus says to his mother, "What have I to do with you?" That reflects an awareness of the speech of the demons in the Gospel according to John. What have you to do with us, Jesus and Nazarene? That strikes me as something of a stretch. That is, even if, let's say, John was aware of Mark, I don't think you could create the story of Cana and Galilee out of the story of the confrontation between Jesus and demons in a synagogue in Nazareth. So sometimes what happens is that the awareness that John sometimes shows of other materials is pushed too hard in the direction of trying to say, therefore, John actually produced his work as a whole out of that awareness. I don't think that is the case. And I also don't think that these gospels exist in an environment without competition. If you read each of the gospels, you get a very clear sense of who is in a position to represent Jesus authentically. And that sense varies from gospel to gospel. So, for example, the vital importance of the 12 that you get at the end of the gospel according to Matthew is not reflected in the gospel according to John, where the issue of the disciple whom Jesus loved instead is made the paramount concern.
Do you think the Gospel of John was written in stages? Some believe that to be the case, and it was assembled by the in its final form, uh, and that final form is what became the canonical Gospel of John in the Bible.
I would certainly agree with the final form idea, and that its likely composition was at the very end of the first century, perhaps even the beginning of the second century. But I think that there's a difference in the composition of John as compared to the Synoptic Gospels. In the Synoptic Gospels, as we have discussed before, I think that it is relatively straightforward to look at differing streams of tradition which fed into each of the Gospels. It appears to me that John's Gospel is, in fact, reliant on really sometimes quite different streams. And there are times when these are indicated by the names of disciples, as occurs in the Synoptics, only different disciples. So, for example, the disciple Philip, designated very early in John's Gospel, comes up repeatedly, and I think is likely to have been the source of one stream of tradition used in John and not used within the Synoptic Gospels. Another very important element, of course, is the entire theology of Jesus being the Logos, the Word of God, which is a highly sophisticated argument made especially at the beginning of the gospel in a way that no other gospel does, but then also pursued very skillfully and sometimes subtly within the body of the work as a whole. This represents some genuine rhetorical attainment. And it has been suggested, and I'm inclined to agree, that this emphasis upon Jesus as the Logos should be associated with another apostolic figure, namely Apollos, who came from Alexandria, which in fact was the home of the Logos theology, especially as articulated by Philo of Alexandria. And then finally, and I think this has to do with why this gospel is so skillfully put together. Finally, there is a very strong sacramental interest in the gospel according to John, which I think is deployed in order to weave the various strands together and to make an argument that at the end of the day, the authority to speak on Jesus' behalf rests in the extent to which one is near to Jesus and also the extent to which one has been forgiven by Jesus. So that the figures of the beloved disciple, together with Peter, come by the very close in chapter 21 to dominate the sense of how this movement is to continue. The total result is, in my opinion, one of the greatest achievements as literature within the New Testament. And for that reason, I'm a little bit wary of seeing it as assembled in stages. I think what's going on, rather, is that the final composer is weaving these strands together.
So do you think that John at all was familiar with Mark, Matthew, and Luke, or just with similar sources, but not quite those specific gospels?
On the whole, I'm inclined to think that given this relatively late stage of composition, that John is actually aware of other gospels. I think he's also aware of earlier traditions. That's why he's not bound by those gospels, both in the sense that he might go in a different direction. So, for example, when it comes to the anointing of Jesus, he has his own view of what the identity of the woman who anointed Jesus was, and he pursues that quite trenchantly. He also has a different account of the resurrection scene than is existent in any other gospel. So he's obviously not tied to them. I think sometimes he is aware of alternative traditions, which he prefers. For example, the traditions of, say, Philip or Apollos. And also sometimes he simply goes out on his own on the basis of his understanding of sacramental insight in order to insist upon his own view of these materials.
How early do you think John's sources date? Do you think some of John's sources go as far back as perhaps the 40s CE or even earlier?
Well, in a sense, insofar, let's say, as Philip is concerned, they would go back to when he was called as a disciple. The situation would be similar to that of the synoptic gospels. In one sense, you can say the synoptic gospels, insofar as they depend upon Peter, can be dated from the time of the call of Peter, though it does seem clear that the materials in Peter's name were only assembled after the resurrection. That is, you're dealing from the 30s and then into the 40s. And I would incline to say the same in regard to Philip. It's likely to have been an early oral stream, which circulated along with the streams of, say, Peter and James and teachers of that generation, and then over time was interacting with other traditions and finally incorporated within John's gospel. Apollos, I would have thought, would have been a bit later, but we know that Apollos was active within the time of Paul because Paul overtly refers to him. Interestingly, not in an altogether favorable way. In fact, they were quite clearly competitors in important church centers. One way I think we can identify the importance of figures is when they rub up against one another. So it's the fact that Peter and James don't agree, which tells us that each of them is independently important. And I think the same is true in regard to Apollos and then in regard to Philip.
Do you think John has some sayings of Jesus that are independent of the synoptics, like sayings of Jesus are in John, but not found in the synoptics?
They are indeed independent, and the most important of them occur within the idiosyncratic and brilliant Johannine discourses. For example, Jesus' discourse regarding himself as the bread of life. But I would be inclined to see that as an independent, but not what we would call historical vein of Jesus' teaching. That is what occurs, I believe, within the Gospel according to John, especially in its sacramental mode, is a exploration of the meaning of Jesus, which means that sayings are attributed to him, which in fact were generated within the worship environment of John, and not as a matter of tradition from an earlier period. One can see a similar approach going on in the 2nd century in the Gospel according to Thomas. Thomas takes the position of saying that these are the sayings of the living Jesus. And when it says living Jesus, it means the risen Jesus. And the idea is that Thomas takes it on itself to speak on behalf of the resurrected Jesus himself. And this is a characteristic of quite a few of the sources of Gnostic Gospels found at Nag Hammadi. I think they're actually perpetuating an approach that you can also see in the Gospel according to John. The point of view which holds that if you come to an insight which is true in regard to Jesus in relation to God, then that insight always existed, and therefore it can be attributed to Jesus himself. There is a similar hermeneutic that operates in rabbinic literature. In rabbinic literature, it is taught that if you come to a valid finding of halakha, that was originally revealed to Moses. The idea is that there's a single standard of authority, whether it's revealed today or remembered from yesterday, but it must be, if it's valid, it has always been. And that is also part of the perspective of John's gospel, that Jesus' utterances are understood to be timeless. They are less embedded than is the case in the synoptic gospels. We're not yet to the stage in John's gospel that will later happen in Gnostic literature of the discourses lifting up entirely from a cultural environment and simply being presented as direct assertions of Jesus from eternity without reference to historical situation. That makes the gospel according to Thomas, for example, sometimes quite difficult to interpret, but it also gives Thomas its very clear appeal to the idea of a eternal disclosure. John is moving in that direction without actually arriving there. That's something that will only occur, I think, in the 2nd century.
Compare the Philippians, hymn, when it talks about that Christ was no, not the hymn itself, but the epistle to the Philippians in general, because it says somewhere in there that Jesus was a pre-existent being.
Mm-hmm.
And that in John chapter 1, Jesus is the Word manifesting in flesh. What do you think is going on there? Do you think there's a relationship between these two texts?
I think there is a relationship. I think what we're getting in the epistle to the Philippians, and you're quite right, that hymn, being in the form of God, did not think equality with God to be a thing that should be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. Remarkable, incisive insistence upon, again, what we were just talking about, the idea that what happens in the particular historical case of Jesus is, in fact, rooted in eternity. This is a point of agreement between Paul and John. And for that reason, not so much in recent years, but over the course of several decades, what you'll see is that there is a considerable amount of scholarly investigation of the relationship between John and Paul. And one reason for that is that they both arrive at this understanding of Jesus being a figure that you have to understand in terms of eternity if you're going to understand him at all. Now, they arrive at that point, interestingly, by differing routes. John, in his gospel, does so by means of the route of, I think, the stream of Apollos, according to which Jesus should be understood as the embodiment of the Word of God, just as you say, become flesh. And this is a highly philosophical notion because the idea of the Logos was resonant with the teaching of Stoicism and also with Platonism. These thought worlds were already brought together by the Jewish thinker Philo of Alexandria, who presents the idea of God making the world by means of an image of himself, namely the Logos. You see how near that is to John's gospel, except that John's gospel then accepts this idea of the Logos and insists that it is Jesus in himself. And that has resonance because in the Stoic understanding, the Logos is a creative force. It is what permits the entire world to be coherent. So this understanding in John is of an overtly philosophical and rhetorical nature. In the case of Paul, writing to the Philippians and elsewhere, he is using the conception of the image of God in a different way, not as philosophical, but rather as existential, rather asserting that the actual intention of God in the creation of human beings was for their eternity. And in Paul's understanding, the primal case of God's success in creating eternal humanity was Christ. And that's why he makes the comparison when he writes to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 between Christ and Adam. The idea was that we have a certain inheritance which comes to us from Adam, but then likewise we also have an inheritance from the man of heaven, namely Christ. So these are two understandings of eternity, which I think very interestingly surface in the decades after the resurrection and provide Christianity with a language by which it can conceive of Jesus being eternal in a way that can be compared to God's eternity.
I know that there are some scholars like Dr. Bart Ehrman who believe that the Philippians hymn is a poetic hymn that goes back before Paul's epistles, and that it was incorporated into the epistle to the Philippians. And he thinks the language in there indicates that it was written in sometime in the 30 CE. Do you agree with that?
I can see the reason for the analysis that in Philippians, Paul is incorporating an earlier hymn. I myself see no reason to date it as early as the 30s. It seems to me that rather it does require knowledge of the kind of argument that Paul had previously made in his Corinthian correspondence. And therefore, I'm inclined more to the 50s. But I have to agree entirely that when we date contributions of this kind, we are always making estimates. But it does seem to me that the move into this understanding of Christ as being necessarily eternal is something that did not occur immediately. So the 30s is early. I mean, in the 30s, I think those within the Jesus movement were still grappling with a initial understanding of resurrection. Once they came to view the resurrection in a way that permitted communication across the range of experiences of how Jesus had risen from the dead, then I think it could move into the investigation of how he could be understood as being eternal.
Do you think that it's also possible that Paul and the author of the Gospel of John were aware of common sources that could have caused such an agreement like this?
I think they were, and that in this case, Paul is very helpful in permitting us to understand how this could have happened. Because in that same chapter in 1 Corinthians, in chapter 15, in which he compares Christ and Adam, that is very much his take on a common assertion of Christianity more broadly, namely that Christ had been raised from the dead. In that same chapter, as he opens up his discussion, Paul also names others by whom Jesus was seen as living after he was executed by the Romans. And as a result of that, we get a very clear understanding of who the people were to whom the early Christian movement turned. He names Peter, calling him Kepha, Cephas, the 12. Paul also speaks of more than 500 people by whom Jesus was seen at once. He refers also to James, the brother of Jesus, and finally also to what he calls all the apostles. So Paul is very well aware that there are a considerable number of people who are coordinating their experience in order to understand what it meant for Jesus to be seen after he had been executed, and to relate that for their expectations of how God's kingdom was going to be revealed. So I think in 1 Corinthians, we can see Paul in the midst of that struggle. And he is not struggling in a way in which he's often portrayed. He's not struggling as the only one to be wrestling with this issue. This is a widespread issue within earliest Christianity. And it demanded a confrontation not only with the experience of one's own stream of tradition, but also with other streams of tradition. One feature of what Paul does here, which I find very striking, is that he is very willing to name people as authorities with whom he disagreed. Right? He disagreed with James, the brother of Jesus, did not always agree with Peter, but he has no hesitancy about referring to them and about admitting that he came to this list of those by whom Jesus was seen last of all because of the circumstances of his own conversion. Now, what that suggests to me is that there is a willingness within earliest Christianity for these various authorities to recognize not only the existence, but also the particular strengths of other authorities. There is within the New Testament a willingness to agree to disagree on certain points, which enables us, I think, to understand why in the Gospels there should be such different accounts of the resurrection. And of course, John joins this. I mean, John has resurrection accounts you don't find in the synoptics. And the reverse is also true. Sometimes the synoptic presentation stands entirely on its own. Paul is happily willing to acknowledge that he appeared to Kepha, to Peter, before Christ appeared to him, but that doesn't prevent Paul from arguing for his own point of view in the material that follows. And I think that once there's a common vocabulary of resurrection, which we can see being developed within the New Testament, then that raised the question, why should Christ have been what Paul elsewhere calls the first fruits? Why should that have been the initial disclosure of humanity in that eternal aspect that God had always intended? Well, that then brings you directly into the Christological question. And I think that's the commonality between John and Paul. I think that they both, in their differing ways, understand that Christological question needs to be addressed because it follows naturally from the recognition that Christ had been raised from the dead.
There are many that believe that the final two verses in the Gospel of John is suggesting that the Gospel was written by the beloved disciple. But I also know that classical scholars such as B.H. Streeter believed that those two verses were added later and they were not original to the Gospel of John. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, this takes us into the whole question of chapter 21 of John. Because yes, what you say about the final two verses is entirely accurate, but it also raises the question about chapter 21, since the close of chapter 20 really seems to conclude the gospel when you consider the way in which you had a series of disclosures of Jesus raised from the dead in Jerusalem. He commissions his disciples. He has the encounter with Thomas. And then you have the statement, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. And that just seems to be the perfect coda to the entire book. It sort of stitches up very nicely with the prologue, the idea that as many as believed in him, they became sons of God. Well, here you have this issue of belief in chapter 20. What more could you want? And the answer is, well, we could want chapter 21. So why is chapter 21 there at all? One reason for that is that John, and here, unlike Luke, gives us a resurrection appearance in Galilee. And that's the very center of chapter 21, including the whole commission of Peter. And now Peter, who's instructed to tend the flock of Christ, is given a restored position after his denial of Christ earlier. This had been a point that was particularly stressed by Raymond Brown in his fine commentary on the Gospel according to John. So it appears that one of the motivations for chapter 21 is to make room for a whole stream of tradition that had been eliminated in Luke, namely the Galilean tradition of the resurrection. And yet it focuses quite intently upon Peter, rather than the 12 as a whole, which we get in the Gospel according to Matthew. So here again, John is going its own way, but then that comes back to your question, why is it going its own way? Why is it, in effect, breaking up its own literary structure in order to do that? And so at the very close of chapter 21, we then have the discussion about the beloved disciple. And then this is the disciple who is bearing witness to these things and who has written these things. Interestingly, then it says, and we know that his witness is true. So who is the we? I mean, it is, as it were, an editorial we. But there are also many other things which Jesus did, were every one of them to be written, I suppose, now back to an I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. I think that is key to an understanding of who the beloved disciple is. I think in the understanding of John, the beloved disciple is anyone who can put himself in a position to understand Jesus and what Jesus is saying. And his overall argument is that that beloved disciple can be found anywhere in this story because he keeps cropping up. And he can also be found within the process of remembering these materials. So that the beloved disciple, in my opinion, is fundamentally a symbolic figure. And the entire question which has been posed, is he John, the son of Zebedee? Is he Apollos? Is he Lazarus? There have been a remarkable number of suppositions in this regard. I think you will find that none of them actually can hold up because of the way in which the beloved disciple permeates the composition of the gospel as a whole. And that's why I'm inclined to view him as a symbolic figure. And that also, for me, explains why chapter 21 is there. That is, John's intent is basically to say, I've concluded the gospel of chapter 20. Chapter 21, I'm dealing with the issue of how Jesus, as eternal, can continue to be accessed by believers. And the answer is when that occurs, then the beloved disciple is with him.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Dr. Chilton.
It's been a pleasure.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.